America has had a total of more than 45 presidents. Every 4 years elections are held. But what if I told you that while some presidents are praised for their actions, some are hated so badly that 75% of their followers have unfollowed them? In this video, we deep dive into America's 12 most hated presidents, focusing on the choices and actions that propelled them to the top of this list. Stick around because by the end of the video, you'll understand why Donald Trump, despite 2 impeachments, still sits at the top and has still been voted president, even though hated. Number 12. Ronald Reagan. As the 40th president, Reagan was both celebrated and condemned. His economic policies, famously known as Reaganomics, aimed to stimulate growth by cutting taxes and reducing regulations. But while the economy surged, the divide between rich and poor grew wider, leaving many Americans frustrated. Then came the Iran-Contra affair, where Reagan's administration secretly sold weapons to Iran, using the funds to support rebel fighters in Nicaragua. This scandal shattered public trust, exposing cracks in his leadership. Despite this, Reagan stood firm against the Soviet Union, even calling it the evil empire, which some say helped end the Cold War but also raised the stakes dangerously high. His stance on civil rights is not so popular, as Reagan's lack of support for affirmative action drew serious backlash from those advocating for equality. Number 11. Barack Obama. As the 44th president, Obama was a symbol of hope, but his years in office weren't without controversy. His Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, expanded healthcare access for millions. Yet rising premiums and limited options stirred frustration. Also, to tackle the Great Recession, Obama pushed through stimulus efforts that steadied the economy, but critics argued it wasn't enough to lift struggling Americans. Foreign policy was another minefield. His troop withdrawal from Iraq left a vacuum that fueled the rise of ISIS, and his approach to immigration reform left many feeling the core issues went unresolved. Obama's use of drone strikes sparked ethical debates, with concerns over civilian casualties shadowing his counterterrorism tactics. Number 10. Zachary Taylor. Serving as the 12th president, Taylor's time in office came with complex challenges. Firstly, a national war hero from the Mexican-American War, where he entered the presidency celebrated for his military accomplishments, but without any prior political experience. This lack of political background led to tensions, especially when he took a firm stand against the expansion of slavery into new territories. Southern leaders saw this as a direct threat, creating friction within the nation. Taylor's short-lived presidency was overshadowed by the intense debates around the Compromise of 1850, an attempt to address slavery in newly acquired territories, yet it only pushed the nation closer to division. His advocacy for a strong, unified nation became one of his central values. But his unexpected death in 1850 meant he couldn't fully carry out his vision. His refusal to budge on slavery further isolated him from political allies, leaving behind a fragmented and conflicted political scene. Number 9. Herbert Hoover. Serving as the 31st president, Hoover entered office during one of America's most precarious times. It is often said that the infamous stock market crash of 1929 occurred shortly after his inauguration, leading into the Great Depression. Also, many saw Hoover as the face of this economic catastrophe, blaming him for the hardships that followed, and his approach to addressing the crisis leaned heavily on volunteerism and limited government intervention, which, while intended to promote resilience, was widely criticized for not being enough in such a severe downturn. He introduced the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to try and stabilize the economy, but by then, it was largely considered a too little, too late effort. One of the most damning moments of his presidency came during the 1932 Bonus Army protest, when veterans seeking early payment were forcibly removed by military order, furthering the public's disapproval. His failure to clearly communicate recovery plans left a feeling of distrust, making him one of America's least favorably remembered presidents. Number 8. Warren G. Harding. As the 29th president, Harding campaigned on a promise of a return to normalcy post-World War I, appealing to a nation ready for peace and prosperity. He supported pro-business policies that initially helped drive economic growth, but also led to rampant corruption. The infamous Teapot Dome scandal, where federal oil reserves were secretly leased, became a symbol of his administration's shady dealings. Many of Harding's key appointees, referred to as the Ohio Gang, were implicated in various scandals, severely undermining public trust. His untimely death in 1923 cut short any potential corrective actions, leaving a complex legacy with lasting implications on how the public perceived governmental integrity. Number 7. Millard Filmore. Serving as the 13th president, Fillmore's rise came after Zachary Taylor's death, and he was thrust into a nation deeply divided by slavery. His tenure was shaped by his endorsement of the Compromise of 1850, which attempted to calm tensions by admitting California as a free state, but also reinforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. This act outraged abolitionists and pro-slavery supporters alike, casting Fillmore as a figure trying to appease both sides, but pleasing neither. His administration's enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act led to further divisions in the North, as many saw it as a betrayal of anti-slavery ideals. His perceived lack of strong leadership and his ineffective handling of these challenges painted a picture of a presidency struggling to make a decisive impact. His failed re-election bid in 1852 marked the decline of the Whig Party, signaling the growing polarization over slavery that would soon engulf the nation. Number 6. John Tyler. Tyler's presidency, as the 10th president, began with an unprecedented situation: the sudden death of William Henry Harrison, making Tyler the first vice president to step into office due to a vacancy. His rise led to skepticism about his legitimacy. His firm commitment to states' rights and limited government frequently put him in direct opposition to his own Whig Party, leading to persistent conflicts within his administration. His pursuit of annexing Texas became a major focal point, underpinned by his support for expanding pro-slavery territory, which sparked heated debates across the nation. His repeated vetoes of key Whig policies, including the establishment of a national bank, alienated him from political allies. Ultimately, Tyler's presidency ended with him isolated, having been cast aside by both major parties due to his divisive stance on numerous issues, a clear example of a presidency marred by polarization and a lack of enduring support. Number 5. William Henry Harrison. Serving as the 9th president, Harrison's brief presidency is remembered more for its brevity and circumstances than for any policy impact. Running on the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," he leaned into his image as a war hero and a champion of the common man. Upon taking office, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in history, speaking for nearly 2 hours in cold, wet weather, a decision that proved costly. Soon after, he fell gravely ill and, just 1 month into his term, passed away, making him the first president to die in office and prompting new considerations around presidential succession. Harrison's legacy is overshadowed by his untimely death, leaving little room for significant accomplishments or influence. Number 4. Donald J. Trump. Serving as the 45th president, Trump's 2016 campaign focused on immigration, trade, and an America First approach, drawing substantial support from voters seeking a new direction. During his administration, he enacted the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, aiming to fuel economic growth through tax cuts, though it also significantly increased the national deficit. His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, often criticized for perceived delays and lack of coordination, became a major point of public scrutiny. Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, securing a conservative judicial majority with effects that still resonate today. Yet, despite all this, and following a tumultuous end to his term, marked by the January 6th Capitol riot and a second impeachment, Trump remains at the center of American politics. The question on many minds remains: how, despite 2 impeachments, does he still sit at the top? And why is he ran for presidency and still won against Kamala Harris and won even though still hated by the Americans? This resilience and controversy placed Trump in a league of his own, making him a uniquely polarizing figure in U.S. history. Number 3. Franklin Pierce. Serving as the 14th president, Pierce's presidency centered around territorial expansion but faced intense criticism for his support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed territories to decide the issue of slavery themselves. The act sparked violent conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas and damaged Pierce's reputation as he struggled to balance the interests of pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. Pierce's attempts to unify the Democratic Party faltered, with opposition from Northern Democrats against slavery's spread and Southern Democrats supporting it. His foreign policy ambitions, such as his failed attempt to acquire Cuba, were seen as imperialistic and drew widespread disapproval. Ultimately, Pierce's inability to address the rising sectional tensions contributed to the Democratic Party's decline and paved the way for the Civil War. Number 2. Andrew Johnson. As the 17th president, Johnson assumed office following Lincoln's assassination, taking on the enormous task of rebuilding the nation post-Civil War. His lenient approach to Reconstruction, including granting pardons to former Confederates, angered radical Republicans who advocated for stronger protections for freed slaves. Johnson's vetoes of civil rights legislation and opposition to the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to African Americans, deepened the political divide. His clashes with Congress led to his impeachment in 1868, making him the first U.S. president to be impeached. He narrowly escaped removal by one Senate vote. Johnson's leadership is widely criticized for failing to promote unity or justice during a critical time of national recovery. Number 1. James Buchanan. Serving as the 15th president, Buchanan's inability to confront the slavery issue during his term is a central critique of his leadership. He believed the matter was best left to individual states and territories, which allowed tensions to escalate. Buchanan's support for the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution in Kansas further alienated the North and exacerbated divisions. When Southern states began seceding in 1860, Buchanan took a passive stance, arguing that the federal government had no authority to intervene, which many viewed as a betrayal of the Union. As he left office, the nation was on the brink of civil war, and his presidency is often considered one of the least effective, with a legacy marked by missed opportunities to preserve unity. Having seen these 12 most hated presidents, we have prepared another breakdown of America's 12 most loved presidents. You can check it out. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.